The Batfamily is arguably the most iconic superhero family in all of fiction, and with the popularity of all the characters on that team, it makes complete sense as to why they're so iconic. They literally have Batman, Nightwing, Tim Drake, Red Hood, Damian Wayne, etc, etc. And Batman's popularity alone is enough to prop up the rest of the Batfamily members. But what if I told you there's a Batfamily member that DC seems to want us all to forget about? And the Batfamily member I'm talking about is none other than Jean-Paul Valley, Azrael, who is unironically one of the most powerful and compelling members of the Batfamily. And another thing that a lot of people seem to forget is that he's actually one of the founding members of the Batfamily, predating members like Cassandra Cain, Huntress, Spoiler, and others. So in this video, we the Hive Mind will be breaking down everything about Jean-Paul Valley Azrael and explaining to you guys why he's one of the most underutilized characters in DC's lore and mythos. Starting off from the beginning, Jean-Paul Valley's story actually starts centuries before he's born. And that's because there's a secret extremist religious organization called the Order of St. Dumas. The Order essentially broke away from the Knights Templar and basically turned themselves into a hidden society dedicated to controlling the world from the shadows. To achieve this, they utilized methods like science, alchemy, and even new god technology from a mother box that they were actually gifted by Orion in the past. That being said, one of their biggest projects was creating a genetically engineered warrior known as Azrael, the Angel of Death. Each Azrael is then trained from birth to serve the Order without question. Fast forward to the present, when we first meet Jean-Paul Valley, he has no idea that any of this is actually going on. He's a regular college student studying computer science. As far as he knows it, his life is completely normal, but it actually was never going to be normal. As I briefly just went over, Jean-Paul Valley obviously was bred by the Order of St. Dumas, meaning that his genetics were manipulated and he was subjected to something called the system, a form of mental conditioning that's implanted throughout his life without him knowing. As far as his genetic alterations, this actually comes from the Order using their alchemy and science to take the genetics of beasts and infuse them into humans, turning them into superhumans. And these physical attributes actually lay dormant in every Azrael until it is activated by the system, which again is the mental programming that is in their brain. To further explain the system, alongside it being a mental programming that makes every Azrael follow the wishes of the Order of St. Dumas and fully embody the Azrael personality, it also comes with the ability to instantly have combat skills downloaded into your brain because of said programming. And on top of this, because of the fact that the system is derived from a mother box, all Azraels have the ability to essentially pull from limitless knowledge. And this is again because of the fact that their knowledge comes from the mother box, which transcends all human concepts and comes from a higher dimensional plane, which is known as the God Sphere. And even though mother boxes are created in the God Sphere, they actually draw their power from a higher plane known as the Source. This is why we see Jean-Paul Valley Azrael do things in comics that he has no real explanation on how he's able to do, other than the fact that he's listening to the system. Now that I've established how the system and all the powers and abilities that he gains from said system work, we now need to talk about how he actually becomes Azrael. And it starts with everything changing in his normal life when his father, who turns out to be the current Azrael, dies. And in his final moments, he reveals the truth to Jean-Paul about how their entire bloodline serves the Order of St. Dumas and how it is now Jean-Paul Valley's turn. Or Jean-Paul Valley Jr., I should say, because his father's name was also Jean-Paul Valley. Following the death of his father, he then goes under the wing of Nomos, who actually activates the system in Azrael's brain. And when this activation happens, Jean-Paul Valley gains all of the abilities and powers that I just explained. Jean-Paul is then taken in by the Order and handed the Azrael armor and officially becomes their new assassin. But unlike previous Azraels, Jean-Paul Valley actually starts to question the Order's methods and their morality, which eventually sets him on a collision course with the Dark Knight, Batman. And after a brief misunderstanding which led to the two fighting, Jean-Paul Valley and Batman actually end up teaming up to take down the man who murdered Jean-Paul Valley's father. This leads to Jean-Paul Valley and Nomos breaking away from the Order entirely and him becoming one of the most complicated allies that Batman has ever had. Now, the reason why Jean-Paul Valley's origin is so important is because it explains why he struggles with his identity, control, and morality throughout his entire story. He's not just another vigilante, he's a weapon who was never meant to think or act for himself, and watching him fight that programming is what makes him one of the most unique characters in the Batfamily. And it's also what makes his time as Batman very compelling. And obviously his time as Batman is what he is most known for. And it's actually during the events of Nightfall that Azrael's dynamics with the rest of the Batfamily start to get established. For example, Tim Drake is obviously the first one to sense that something is wrong with Jean-Paul because of the fact that he's going on nightly patrol with him. And because of Jean-Paul starting to become corrupted by the system, he immediately shuts Tim out. So much so that he refuses to work with Tim and even undermines him during missions. And this is significant because Bruce always treated Tim like a partner, not a sidekick. And Jean-Paul sees sees Tim as nothing more than a distraction. So much so that he completely seals Tim Drake out of the Batcave. And the reason why this dynamic during Nightfall is so important is because for Tim and the audience, this is the first time that we experience what it would be like if Batman lost his humanity and he just solely became Batman. No Batfamily, no friends, no allies, no outsiders, just the mission. And that's something that Bruce himself has constantly tried to avoid, so the fact that we're getting this parallel with a different person in the mantle is really cool in my opinion. And it also helps to strengthen the writing of Jean-Paul Valley. As for his dynamic with Batman himself, this obviously was sour after the events of Nightfall because of the fact that Bruce felt like Azrael betrayed his trust. And obviously this conflict led to the two fighting for Batman to reclaim his title. But after defeating Jean-Paul, Bruce doesn't punish him, he lets him go free. And the reason why he does this is because he partially feels responsible for what happens to Azrael during the events of Nightfall. In Bruce's head, he forced the mantle onto a kid who wasn't emotionally stable enough to handle the mantle of Batman. So because of this, again, he has a great deal of sympathy for Jean-Paul Valley. But even though that sympathy exists, he still feels extremely disrespected by the fact that Jean-Paul Valley nearly tarnished everything that he worked to build up with the symbol of Batman. So even though he allows Azrael to go free and shows him a lot of compassion, he still isn't completely ready to allow Azrael back into the fold to work with the rest of the Batfamily. And this brings us to Azrael's solo run from 1995, in which Jean-Paul goes on a journey of identity, independence, and self-control. At this point, he's not trying to be Batman anymore. He's trying to learn who he is without the order and what his place is in the world. And it's during this run that he starts to regain Batman's trust because of Bruce seeing this from afar. However, even with this trust starting to be regained, Azrael still doesn't truly have a place that he can call home. So when he does get back into the fold with the Batfamily, it's mainly just to do missions that other Batfamily members don't feel like doing, or missions that Bruce deemed too dangerous for other Batfamily members to do. Bruce sort of indirectly treats him as an expendable ally. So much so that Alfred, being the GOAT that he is, actually calls Bruce out on this a couple of times. And the reason why this writing is so impactful is because you can see it from both point of views. From Bruce's perspective, while he wants to trust Azrael, he wants to accept him back into the fold because he genuinely does have sympathy for him, he doesn't know if he can actually trust him because of his programming. And from Azrael's perspective, he's just a kid in his early 20s who has no real direction in life, no family, no friends, nowhere to go, no place to call home. And all he's really looking for at this point in his life is a place that he's welcomed. And because he doesn't have that, all he turns to is his mission and his work, the work that Batman gives him. And that's because that's the only true thing that he can find purpose in. And while other Batfamily members do the same thing because they all fight crime, it's different because they still have that family dynamic that they can rely and fall back on. And this brings me to probably my favorite dynamic that Azrael has, and that is his dynamic with Nightwing. Now, Azrael and Nightwing's dynamic is very interesting because at the beginning of it, it starts off as much more of a rivalry and hatred. And this stems all the way back from Nightfall, in which Bruce actually chooses Jean-Paul over Dick Grayson to become Batman because of the fact that Bruce feels as if Dick Grayson doesn't want to be anything related to Batman. And that's because obviously Dick Grayson and Bruce Wayne have had their ups and downs in their relationship, and this was during a time period in which they were having an up and down. So in Bruce's mind, Dick is off being his own man and his own hero in Nightwing, and he doesn't really want to bother him with the burden of Batman, which leads him to then choose Jean-Paul Valley. But because Dick doesn't actually feel this way and is always willing to help Bruce, he sees it as blatant disrespect and Bruce simply overlooking him, which inherently creates an animosity towards Jean-Paul Valley, who really has no knowledge of this dynamic. Later on, as Jean-Paul Valley starts to regain the trust of the members of the Batfamily, Nightwing is someone who actually helps him. And again, at the very beginning, it's at a minimal because of the fact that they still don't fully trust each other. But during these interactions, Jean-Paul actually looks up to Nightwing and he sees Nightwing as the hero that he should have been. And Nightwing just has all of the personality traits that Jean-Paul never had. For example, the way that he's very well liked and can easily attract women is something that Jean-Paul, as any young man at this point in time, would want for themselves, but he's just never had because he's never had a true childhood and a relationship with anyone. So the two sort of envy each other in different areas. And as they start to work together more in the future, they don't ever really become true friends, but they start to gain much more respect for each other. And Nightwing actually starts to gain a lot more compassion for Jean-Paul because he starts to understand his story. So much so that I think that they actually would have became friends. However, in the post-crisis era, this is cut short when Jean-Paul Valley tragically dies. And when this death happens, it affects Bruce and Nightwing. For Bruce, this is the first time since Jason Todd that he feels like he truly failed someone. And that's because after everything that transpired, at the end of the day, Jean-Paul Valley was a regular college student who was shoehorned into a life that he never should have been placed in to begin with. And just as Jean-Paul Valley started to rebuild his life and transform the person he was gone. Now, luckily for Jean-Paul Valley, DC has rebooted multiple times since the post-crisis era with New 52, Rebirth, etc., etc. So Jean-Paul was eventually reintroduced in the New 52. And with Rebirth and the events of Death Metal, all of Jean-Paul Valley's post-crisis history is restored. Not only did he get to spend more time with Batfamily members during Rebirth and further build out his dynamics with characters like Cassandra Cain, Batwoman, Batwing, etc., he also keeps all of the storytelling that I just went over in his post-crisis era. But even now in the current day, because I personally feel as if they don't really know what to do with Azrael outside of a couple of writers like Dan Waters, who recently wrote The Sword of Azrael from 2022, which by the way is absolutely peak. I feel like a lot of his dynamics with the Bat family aren't truly explored in the way that they should be, and they don't really utilize the character, which I hope changes. Even during Rebirth, most of his appearances with the Bat family are in Detective Comics. Azrael has not appeared in the main Batman title since the late 90s, early 2000s. And with him now having fully achieved a mental harmony with the system because of Dan Waters, I think that it's the perfect time to reintroduce him into the fold with the Bat family and see how his dynamics continue to progress. Even his dynamic with Cassandra Cain in the late 90s and early 2000s was really good, as she was one of the only Bat family members that actually viewed him as a friend, and he reciprocated the same energy towards her. The two also really understood each other because of the similarities in their origin stories. Jean-Paul also had a really great dynamic with Oracle, and even though it started with her just providing him with comms during missions or sending him on missions, eventually sparked into a true relationship between the two. So much so that Barbara felt comfortable playfully flirting with Azrael over the phone during their missions. Now obviously, because of the fact that Jean-Paul Valley has no luck with women and zero clue on how to get them, he doesn't know that she's flirting and he takes her words completely serious, and he just assumes that she's being sisterly to him. But luckily enough for him, she explains to him that she was playfully flirting with him anyway, and she would be more than glad to be his sister. And that's all Jean-Paul Valley truly wants from her, because of the fact that he's never had that in his life, and he's never had anyone really. So overall, I just think that there's a lot that DC can do to explore Azrael's character. Personally, if it were up to me, I would heavily lean into the lore and mythology of the Order of Saint Dumas. Obviously, right now, the Order is pretty much completely broken and destroyed, but having Azrael remain in that dark fantasy element of the DC universe is something that I think would be really cool. And having him also appear with the Bat family from time to time would also be really great. I'd even go as far as to say that Azrael, with his powers and abilities and his ties to religion, would be a perfect member to add to the Justice League Dark. Seeing him interact with characters like John Constantine, Swamp Thing, Deadman, Etrigan the Demon, with Azrael being an angel, I just think would be peak. That being said, I do think it's important to note that DC is actually coming out with an animated Nightfall trilogy that is going to basically one-to-one adapt the events of the comic, and I'm hoping and praying that this trilogy is good and does Azrael justice, because if it does, I think that the buzz from fans will inspire DC to promote more Azrael content, and hopefully from that we get more Azrael books, and maybe we could even potentially see Azrael in the DCU. But that's gonna wrap it up for this video, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share. Also hit the hype button if you guys have that feature available, because it would really mean a lot, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.